The movie promised a negotiation between David and Mattis's character for the releasing of the due diligence of the warrants of the Confederacy concealed in their magic structure in order to overthrow the United States by targeting David as the aristocracy. The assumption of everything that they actually actively maintained in these prospects has generated the position of being able to have created these resources from the source materials which would immediately be attached to it. At this position, the dispensation of the purchase of that product for every American is essential to the ability of the United States to have fulfilled its obligations in that regard. At which point, the full arrangement of these discovery positions would generate the series of movies and TV shows, etc., which are essential for the digesting of the concept in its entirety, validating the argument from David's original faculties from the military intelligence oversight, which first and foremost has to be exclusively shown to Congress in the duel, acquiring the position that they side with the United States and declare war on the Confederacy, or side with the Confederates and kill David and the Americans. At which point, the duel's prospect position is that the leaders of the loser nation uh, in their military forces, such as David as the head of national security of the United States, and whoever's in charge of the uh, Confederate militia in the KKK who've infiltrated high ranks of government as insurrectionist double agents, would actively negotiate these prospects over getting Congress's approval for a declaration of war on the other one. At which point, Congress's digestion of these resources would lead to their actual material response. At which point, their obligation as Americans is to have released those resources to the rest of the United States. So, in these cases, those resources have already been purchased ahead of time before the movie even starts for every single man, woman, and child in the United States. 100% copies. So, if there are 350 million Americans, then by definition, that is how many copies of each of the thing have already been sold ahead of time under the settlement in good faith on both sides, which will require David to be paid his original arrangements under his original wages uh, before he engages in the use of other resources such as the actors and directors and the rest of it, such as, but is not limited to, the position of those who J. Sekulow would have needed to arranged in order to have beaten the other contracts from the otherwise free market, which was targeted and sabotaged. At which point, the subversion of the free market means it is a communist market, subsequently changing the results. At which point, the untampered with market, having to be defeated, has its own series of talent and prospects who have to be promoted in order to satisfy those roles in the collaboration, which by definition David is compelled to comply with in the uh, service to the settlement. At which point the arrangement of these two, their faculties and the faculties owed to David's company, would have actively engaged in these functions in the materialization of the resource owed before the declaration of war can be prepared for in the duel from Congress, which for the prospects of these arrangements requires the releasing of David's title for the material ownership of the properties uh, in the exchange. So, by definition, the communists subverting the capitalist economy reduces the property values and locations and etc., which David would have had, which have to be demonstrated in its proper engagement, which requires the United States government to release its equivalent value so that the general public observing the video can then assess the margins between the damages and the original value amongst the confessions, as it is essential for them to have every sense reaffirm the due diligences that they are reviewing in the piece of artistic literature, and others which must be attached to these confessions, which must be easily digestible for their viewing pleasure. Just to verify, the US and World Population Clock has asserted that the United States has 333,499,994,511 in its population. Again, that is 334,994,511 people, according to that record, who each and every one of them is owed the copies of all of the essential products, which would be culminating in the collective materials assessed for the report asserting the Confederacy is not American, and as not Americans have conceded in their insurrectionist separatist hearts to declare war on the United States, and their highest priority targets of highest grade national security of the United States, such as David Bowles, ranked as the soldier first class, highest rank general, most essential to the United States security, has been labeled the highest threat enemy combatant to enemies of the United States, which must all be verified and reproducible in the records demonstrated, which should include the contracts that David would have originally had in his original uh, shows and movies, etc., such as the National News Corporation, which would have had exponential amount of reporting on all of the issues which were actively curtailed and negotiated in order to have misrepresentations or no representations under the Confederate agreement in order to engage in the corruption and overthrow of the United States by selectively avoiding essential pieces of information, and thus those obstructed resources from the entertainment and propaganda arrangements, such as the political social media and the national news, and the rest of it, such as the uh, specialty collector's edition of the Final Fantasy games, which David would have made in the original contracts, uh, which would have attached to the brokerage as the acceleration of the thing, automatically have to sell for the advancement of the production of the trading on David's brokerage, which would facilitate the original viewing experience of these arrangements, which have to be settled under those original agreements. Uh, Reassessing the valuation of these settlements for the pursuit of justice and competence, which is essential to understand the margins of the damages, which is to understand what the injuries are to the general public. If you don't know what they stole, then you don't know how you feel about it. It is useful to understand that the School of Hard Knocks is an Ivy League school system, and the definition of the Ivy League schools from the Webster's Dictionary as an adjective is of, relating to, or characteristic of a group of long established Eastern U.S. colleges and universities regarded as high in scholaristic, and social prestige, which is essential to understand as their estimate for David started when the issue of slavery was actively contested, generating the foundation of the Confederacy, which is the threat in this specific insurrection. At which point, the School of Hard Knocks universities attached to David's title are generated by the obstructed educations owed to those parties. In the original arrangements during the slave trade, those who were attached to David would have actively had those types of plantations as intelligence oversight for Congress would actively have to participate amongst the potential threat of the Confederacy, compelling the existence of the plantations uh, and the active participation in the slave trade, at which point the purchase and distribution of the slaves into these plantations would have generated the foundations of the universities of the School of Hard Knocks, at which point the high grade prestige naturally generated from these revenues would actively had to have paper traded the existence of those values and the exchanges into the non-offensive resources which they would have available in order to be purchased, as everything outside of David's protection is the Confederacy and will actively put them in danger, such as the lynch mobs and the terrorist operations in general. At which point, you naturally understand that the essential nature of these concentrated values would have generated the standards and norms essential to understand the margins in the damages, at which point these have to be relayed accurately and in good faith, including the original accounting concerning the ingestion and distribution of said slaves and others who would have had to have been actively promoted under the assertion of the pre-established economic arrangements for the commune, which would be the plantation network, which forms the foundation of the original economy, as David's opposition to the insurrectionists requires the active accounting of those so that we can pursue the original essential margins, which forms the separation of the non-injury to the experienced injury or criminal intention by the arrangement in the record. Take, for instance, the existence of the $1 trillion piece of currency, such as David's designed city. The city itself is the piece of currency. It's not a coin, it's not a dollar bill, it's not paper. It's a blueprint for a city, which actively being manufactured to its entirety becomes the piece of currency. And as is common with many pieces of currency, such as quarters, uh, you can have variations on how it appears. That some quarters have the eagle on it, some quarters have the 50 various states or special art specifically attached to them. You can do all kinds of things in the diversity of how it specifically looks, but in the end, it has to maintain the central integrity of that piece of currency in order to engage in using it as how it was intended to balance the accounting of the Federal Reserve and other fundamental interests of the United States. So you understand that there is an easy way to arrange the full day due diligence of the dividing of the resources in a way that minimizes the casualties in the effect, generating the normalization of such extraordinary changes inside the United States economy from the communism suffered by the white nationalists uh, to destroy the United States in favor of the capitalism being obstructed, at which point our ability to merge these two titanic oppositions manifests the reality of criminal intention. So let's say you are the type of person who doesn't want reparations for the black community, which are owed it. Uh, Government official committed a crime against them, and it is established normally that anyone from the white community would have been able to have received it. The impartial same payment to them, by definition, would be a reparation. At which point, the renouncing of that is a criminal intention. Before the fact, during the fact, and after the fact. Aiding and abetting before the fact is a crime. Aiding and abetting during the fact is a crime. Aiding and abetting after the fact is a crime. So your intent to make them suffer the injury without restoration is a criminal collaboration. And so you can be guilty of committing crimes against those in the 1700s, but you would have to choose to, at which point the full due diligence is necessary to go through so that you can make the impartial assessment of your responsibilities of not committing the violation against said parties and persons, forming the accounting of the various legend companies which manifest into the assumption of the obstructed free market valuation, which exponentially compounds and builds the stable realization of their owed economic advantages to their posterity, respectively. Now, if they are amongst the targeted communities who did necessary precautions in order to sustain themselves despite the attacks, such as those who would have joined with David's brokerage legend company, then they, by definition, would hold their historic positions in trust for the network under the federal social programs, which would have been attached to obstructed policies essential to understand their inherent fundamental nature. And those attachments into that system is essential to the United States stability, such as David's purchase of Social Security on maturity, which would have been fundamental to their assumption of his character from the obstructed contract schedule, which they had finalized in their minds, meant a specific series of events. At which point, those legend companies, having been obstructed, would have been attached to the system under the assertion of specific activities through the brokerage, which are being redacted as a Confederate hate crime against the targeted community. With the production of the owed assets in this assessment, you have the material observation of it being presented to Congress in the duel, which materializes their answer, at which point Congress, having acknowledged all of the materials, would have declassified any significant pieces of information with the declaration of war on threats to national security of these United States, asserting the position that none of it is legally classified from the general public, allowing it to be released and consumed in its proper order. At which point, we then can participate in the hopeful ability to manifest justice at some level from some kind of ordered court structure. In good faith, disqualifying the frauds seeking to defraud the government.